All right, welcome to the fourth Arcanum lecture on the Emperor. Welcome to the Arcanum lecture on the Emperor. Now, the Emperor on the fourth card is alone, without court or retinue. His throne is in no way to be found in a room of the imperial palace, but rather in the open, in an uncultivated field, not located in a town. A meager clump of grass by his foot, there is as the whole imperial court as the witness of his imperial splendor. But the clear sky is spread above him. He is a silhouette on the background of the sky, alone in the presence of the sky. This is how the emperor is. Now, if these initial words from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot don't give you this instant sense of the emperor being a transcendental factor within the Arcanum, explore how Tomberg sees power and authority in a way that addresses earthly issues, but takes a very different approach to the nature of what authority really means and how it should play out in our lives, how it should rule the world, not by compulsion, not by force, but by a surrender of the world to the ideals expressed within it. And there's an initial letter here from Tomberg that I think sets us up nicely for exploring this trump, this tarot trump of the major arcana that has been vastly overlooked. It's one of the most considered to be sort of brushed over in people's explorations. I think that's because there's a lot of issues these days with reconciling ourselves to the ideas of power and authority, especially after the 20th century. So in a letter Tomberg wrote to his friends in 1967, he said, "My meditations on the tarot are no scientific undertaking. Rather, they are a repeated and wide-ranging effort by means of the symbolism of the Hermetic tradition to enter again deeply into the all-encompassing stream of the Catholic tradition in such a way that through a shift in perspective, through the purifying atonement, the Catholic and the Hermetic traditions might be seen as one in harmony with each other." This brings up the most fundamental question, of course, in Meditations on the Tarot, which you might consider to be, how does the Catholic tradition reconcile itself with the Hermetic tradition? Because Catholic is Christian, Hermetic is fundamentally pagan. Let's take a quick look at these three questions. This is some background that will be very helpful for understanding, since a lot of these basic facts aren't really known much anymore as we're in a post-Christian world. So what is the Catholic tradition? Well, it's evolved and undergone various changes through its history from its beginnings up to 1967, which is when Tomberg wrote this letter. And this is very important timing because of the council that had just occurred. Here's some main differences. First, in the early church, in its early years, the Catholic Church was a small community of believers centered around the teachings of Jesus Christ. They were the followers of the way of Jesus of Nazareth, of course. It faced persecution from the Roman Empire, but gradually gained recognition and influence. As it developed, it needed doctrine, and this is where things got interesting and very political. Over time, the Catholic Church developed its doctrines and teachings through ecumenical councils and the writings of theologians. What's considered Catholic today by the World Council of Churches is often actually whether you accept the first 7 councils of the church. They actually classify not only Roman Catholics and Orthodox and Anglicans as Catholic, but they classify even Lutherans as Catholic. So that's a fun little tidbit a lot of people don't realize. The theological versus the political is quite a difference. Now, important developments include the formulation, of course, of the Nicene Creed and the definition of the Trinity and the establishment of the canon of Scripture. Fast forward hundreds of years to the Big Schism in 1054, the Great Schism as it's called, leading to the separation of the Catholic Church in the West, the Roman Catholic, and the Eastern Orthodox Church. This division resulted from theological, cultural, and political differences. And if you've read Aaron Leach's Secrets of the Magical Grimoires, apparently also lyrical, melodic, and poetic differences. He cites an instance of a poem, I believe, that played a role in the Filioque controversy. So there was a lot to it and a lot going on, a lot of different agendas competing for power and control, of course. Then we move up to the Reformation 500 years later. In the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation challenged certain practices and teachings of the Catholic Church, and this led to the formation of Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, and the schisms and denominations continued to proliferate after that. And this all the way up to modern day evangelicalism, which of course has delightfully brought back Christian folk magic in all kinds of wonderful ways. Just don't call it magic. Now, the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, was the significant event in Catholic history because it addressed the theological and disciplinary issues raised by the Protestant Reformation. So this is the beginning of the Counter-Reformation, when we see the Jesuits come up. And this is what's really, really important to understanding a lot of the debates around Tomberg and Rudolf Steiner and their views of Roman Catholicism. Rudolf Steiner was actually a Catholic, despite the fact that anthroposophy in general is very anti-Catholic in practice, if not in theory. They're very opposed to Jesuitism, especially, but so was Tomberg. That doesn't mean they threw the baby out with the bathwater when it came to the mystical or spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. They just separated the Jesuitism that occurred from his movement from the saint himself. So that's something where people get caught up often when they're trying to understand Tomberg's and Steiner's view of these people. The Protestant Reformation initiated reforms within the Catholic Church, including clarifying doctrines, addressing abuses, and emphasizing the importance of education and seminary formation. This is also when the Catholic Church really started clamping down on the celibacy issue. Up until the Counter-Reformation, it was common practice for clergy to have concubines and wives and kids. Most bishops had wives and kids living in their manses. And this is just something that we've sort of lost knowledge of in common understanding. But it was they were very loosey-goosey about the whole celibacy thing until Protestants started accusing them of being lax in their convictions. Moving up to the Vatican Council, the First Vatican Council in 1869 to 1870. It was convened to address various issues, including the role of the Pope, the papal infallibility thing, and the relationship between faith and reason as we moved into the scientific era, further into the scientific era, I should say. It was well underway. So this council affirmed the authority of the Pope and defined the doctrine of papal infallibility under the conditions of speaking ex cathedra and a few other things. Of course, it's only been used twice, I believe, once for this purpose to declare that it was so, and a second time to confirm the bodily assumption of Mary into heaven, I believe. Yeah, other than that, it hasn't been used too much. The reason all of this is important is because it leads us up to Vatican II, which happened in 1962 to 1965, and this is where we get very famous documents like Lumen Gentium, the light of the people, and a lot of reaffirmations about both the commitment to ecumenism and sort of a new opening up of the church to other Christian or ecclesial communities, as they call them. Even in the Second Vatican Council, they can't find their way to calling other Christians churches. They call them ecclesial communities. And a lot of Protestants, of course, were like, you guys sort of, they went up to the finish line but didn't cross it in the view of a lot of non-Catholic Christians. They could have gone a bit further. In a lot of ways, they went too far. And certainly Tomberg has been accused of thinking that they went too far with the eradication of the Old Mass and the institution of colloquial language being used wherever Mass was done. So the church dropped the Latin Mass, switched to the common language. To that extent, it's quite interesting that Roman Catholic priests actually have a harder time getting permission to do Latin masses than other clergy. So Anglican clergy can just do a Latin mass if they want pretty much any time. Most clergy can if they want to. Roman Catholic clergy are the only ones that now have to get permission to do their own original traditional mass, which is all kinds of hilarious. So Tomberg definitely had some thoughts and feelings on the Second Vatican Council, but he never really wrote down what those were. And I think that's a good thing because it allows us to, cut him some slack. Given that was such a tumultuous time, and there's a really vast divisions between, like, many branches of the Roman Catholic Church split off at that point, and we got the Tridentinists and other denomination, or sort of not denominations, but congregations within the Roman Catholic Church that wanted to go back to the older, more historical rituals. They aim to renew and update the church's practices and teachings to better engage with the world, but in those changes, they also lost a lot of the liturgical mysticism and more traditional values. You could think of it in moral terms, but that's really not what it's necessarily about. Oh yes, and you can always drop questions into the chat as I go along, and I'll check them at the end and answer them as I can. Yeah, a bishop. You actually need a bishop. Yeah, I was part of a denomination when I was practicing Roman Catholic that did there is one a set of priests that are trained still in that. I forget the name, but there's an order that trains priests and they only do that, and that's all they do. Priests who could run special parishes just for that purpose, to preserve and celebrate the traditional mass. Of course, the mass really changed many times, and one of the reasons you could argue that the Vatican II mass was a good thing is because the simplicity of it actually is a return to more biblical New Testamental Christian practice. So it was into this milieu of the 60s that Tomberg was writing and putting together this monumental work of meditations on the Tarot. And his goal in moving to the Catholic Church was because he saw it as a universal church, as the Ecclesia Universalis, and really thought that it would be an effective vessel to take his teachings into the world. Of course, presenting magic to Catholics and encouraging ideas of reincarnation and mystical interpretations of church teachings was something that he thought Catholics would appreciate, and many do. Of course, many condemn his work, but people like Cardinal Hans Urs von Balthasar, of course, wrote the foreword to this Meditations on the Tarot, and there's a famous photo of the Tubble hardcover copy of it on the Pope of St. John Paul II that I saw that picture going around 25 years ago. Never knew if it was real or not, but given that it was going around back then, it's unlikely I think that it was fake. I'm sure Pope John Paul was given a copy and probably might have even read some of it. Who knows? He was a big reader, of course. Now, the challenging idea here is the unifying of Catholicism with Hermetic traditions, because Hermetic traditions are inherently pagan. Were they Christianized? There's some debate, and I haven't seen if there's been any new research on that. But there are many people that make arguments that some of the apostles went and participated in a Christianized form of Hermeticism in Alexandria, but I don't know if that's actually something we can verify. What's interesting when we consider this confluence of Christianity and paganism is that they did come from the same source. And there's a tremendous movement these days now questioning if the very fundamental bases for the idea of monotheistic religions. For example, many Jewish scholars in Israel are questioning whether Israel was ever monotheistic. I believe the people at the Hammurabi channel on YouTube are digging into that quite a bit. Tomberg's views on Vatican II are much debated. Some people think he was opposed to the modernizing aspects of it, or some of the social teachings. Some people think he had a problem with the ecumenism, but I think that's not really likely, given he was practicing as a Roman Catholic throughout this time, but also going to Eastern Orthodox masses as well. And he really did have a very idealistic view of the role of the churches, and was quite pragmatic when it came to his decision to convert to it, which is partly what led to a lot of his rejection by the anthroposophical and community of Rudolf Steiner. I know that's a heavy way to start out a lecture, but I'm sure you could handle it. It's just sort of essential, since we can't assume this information anymore. We can't assume that knowledge like we could have 50 years ago. So power and authority. The card teaches us, according to Tomberg, in the first instance that the emperor has renounced compulsion and violence. He has no weapons. His right hand holds the scepter forward, on which his gaze is fixed, and his left hand holds his tightly fastened belt. He is neither standing nor sitting. He is simply leaning back against a lowered throne and has only one foot placed on the ground. His legs are crossed. The shield adorned with an eagle rests on the ground at his side. Lastly, he is wearing a large and heavy crown. Now, we'll consider each of the aspects of this card later, but now let's consider how just Tomberg understands authority. Tomberg begins his letter 4 on the fourth Arcanum, the Emperor, by asserting authority is endowed, essentially by competence and accomplishment, and is a necessary feature for anyone who wants to begin a spiritual school. At higher degrees of the fusion of mysticism with gnosis and the productive power of magic, as Tomberg literally says, although his translation, of course, is Robert Powell's translation from the original French. So I guess not literally, but you know what I mean. He says that a person at a higher level of that can lay down the law, literally lay down the law. What does he mean? I think we are meant to find the first claim to be reasonable, if not extremely idealistic. We have far more charlatans in the world, it seems, than sincere spiritual teachers willing to struggle with rigorous honesty. While Tomberg's latter assertion, I think, is meant to shock or at the very least challenge our comfort. The idea that anyone, of course, of spiritual status could lay down the law is a daunting concept, right? I mean, we expect it these days from politicians, but not from spiritual leaders, right? They're meant to be so open-minded. And so this is what's leading us to the true understanding of Tomberg's view on the emperor, which I think it might not be what you expect.